Yellow Vest protesters have gathered on the Champs-Elysées in Paris for a fifth consecutive weekend of demonstrations. Thousands of police will be deployed in case of violent clashes and disruptions that have marked previous protests. The movement began 5 weeks ago, initially against a rise in fuel taxes, but has since spread to taking other issues, including education reforms. Dozens of people have already been arrested this Saturday. However, so far the number of arrests is much lower than the 500 made around the same time last weekend, and it emerged that a seventh person had died on Friday in an accident resulting from a blockade by protesters. Scuffles broke out in the center of Paris on Saturday, and the police fired tear gas to disperse a crowd trying to make their way through police lines. Some shops and department stores in the city have closed for the day as the protesters defied calls by the French government urging them to stay at home. Last time we were here for taxes, said 28-year-old Conde Jeremy told the news agency. This is for the institutions. We want more direct democracy, he said, adding that people needed to shout to make themselves heard. Some museums are closed, but both the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower remain open. Smaller protests have also been reported in Toulouse, Grenoble and Lyon. In Calais, a group of Yellow Vests blocked the access road to the port. The impact of the Gilets jaunes Yellow Vest demonstrations has been keenly felt in France. The government has been forced to bow to pressure and adjust its economic course. President Emmanuel Macron responded to the nationwide street protests by scrapping an unpopular fuel tax rise and promising an extra
$114
a month for minimum wage earners and tax cuts for pensioners. However, it is far from clear that he has done enough to diffuse public anger. The BBC's Hugh Schofield in Paris says some in the movement are calling for a pause following President Macron's concessions, but there are still Yellow Vests around the country who feel now is not the time to ease the pressure. On Friday, a driver died following a collision with a truck in Orleans, a Walloon municipality on the border with Belgium. The truck had been held up by a group of Yellow Vest protesters. 6 other people have died in connection with the protests. A federal judge in the state of Texas has ruled that a key part of the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare, is unconstitutional. 20 states argued the whole law was invalidated by a change in tax rules last year which eliminated a penalty for not having health insurance. President Donald Trump said the ruling was great news for America. The law, its provisions will, however, remain in place until an appeal is heard at the Supreme Court. President Trump promised to dismantle Barack Obama's landmark 2010 health care law, which was designed to make medical cover affordable for the many Americans who had been priced out of the market. But despite his Republican Party having majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, the act is still operating. However, in 2017 Congress did repeal the requirement the so-called individual mandate that people buy health insurance or pay a tax penalty. Mr. Trump took to Twitter following the judge's ruling in Texas. Well, but not surprisingly, Obamacare was just ruled unconstitutional by a highly respected judge in Texas. Great news for America. End of Twitter post by @RealDonaldTrump. Trump. He also urged incoming Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Democratic Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi to pass a strong law that provides great health care. The ruling came a day before the deadline for Obamacare enrollment for the coming year. To Republicans, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton and his Wisconsin counterpart Brad Schimmel led the legal challenge. Sitting in Fort Worth as District Judge, Reed O'Connor noted that a
$1 5TN
tax bill passed by Congress in
2017
eliminated the tax penalties which anyone who failed to attain health insurance had to pay. He ruled that the individual mandate was now unconstitutional, as the individual mandate was an essential element of the act. The whole of Obamacare was therefore unconstitutional, Judge O'Connor said. He said his ruling was concerned with the intentions of the 2010 and 2017 Congresses. The farmer enacted the ACA. The latter saw both the last leg it stood on. Ms. Pelosi described the ruling as cruel and absurd and said it would be repealed. She said it exposed the monstrous endgame of Republicans' all-out assault on people with pre-existing conditions and Americans' access to affordable health care. Mr. Schumer, meanwhile, said the ruling appeared to be based on faulty legal reasoning, and hopefully it will be overturned. He said that if it was upheld in the higher courts, it will be a disaster for tens of millions of American families, especially for people with pre-existing conditions. The decision is almost certain to be challenged in the Supreme Court. White House spokeswoman Sarah Sanders said that the law would remain in place for the time being, pending further legal developments. Meanwhile, the White House called on Congress to replace Obamacare with an affordable health care system which protects people with pre-existing conditions. But other states have argued that eliminating Obamacare would harm millions of Americans, and pending any appeal, the landmark health care law remains in place. As Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer said, if this awful ruling is upheld in the higher courts, it will be a disaster for tens of millions of American families. 3 bills looted by us troops more than a century ago have been returned to their church in the Philippines. President Rodrigo Duterte praised his countrymen and the us at a ceremony in Balangita, where the treasures were taken 117 years ago. The bronze bells were seized during the Philippine-American War as part of reprisals following a massacre. In August, the Champs-Elysées announced the return of the so-called Balangita bells. After decades of pressure, nobody can claim a singular credit for the generous act of the Americans. Mr. Duterte told a Dublin crowd on Saturday, the credit goes to the American people and to the Filipino people, period. The president had called for their return in a
2017
speech, in which he also suggested building closer ties with China. The bells are viewed as a symbol of Philippine independence against their former colonial masters, following the Balangita massacre of 1901, when Filipino militants ambushed and killed 48 US troops. As General Jacob H. Smith ordered the area be turned into a howling wilderness. US troops seized the 3 bronze bells as war trophies during the bloody reprisals. Thousands of Filipinos are thought to have been killed, despite calls for their return for decades. As veterans and politicians said the bells were tributes to the killed US troops and refused to consider their repatriation. One of the bells was with the United States 9th Infantry Regiment in Korea, and the other 2 were at a former 11th Infantry Regiment base in Wyoming. But after continued Filipino pressure and waning opposition in the United States, the bells were flown to Manila earlier this week for Saturday, a ceremony in Balangita. We are the happiest people on earth now.
81YEAR.OLD
Nancy Odoran told AFP news agency. The whole town is walking in the clouds because the bells are finally with us. However, for some the return struck a more somber note. Constance Elba told at the Bell's gave her mixed emotions, given the history surrounding them. It was painful and you cannot take it away from us, she said. We can never forget that Mahinda Rajapaksa has resigned as Sri Lanka's Prime Minister 7 weeks after he was appointed, in a surprise move that sparked a political crisis. Mr Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka, his former president, signed his resignation letter in a ceremony at his house. His son, Namal, told the BBC his father had quit to ensure national stability. The resignation could bring to an end a nearly 2-month-long power struggle that has dented confidence in Sri Lanka's stability. In October, President Maithripala Sirisena sacked then Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, replacing him with Mr Rajapaksa. Mr Wickremesinghe is expected to return to office on Sunday.